Hey guys, it's Sherry Vegas, and in this tutorial today I'm going to be going over a really common question that I get asked all the time about Jesmonite, and that is how to colour it and what pigments can you use. So this is going to be a bit of a fast tutorial for me today, but because this question just is popping up so much in all of my other videos to do with Jesmonite, and it kind of does need a bit more of an explanation, I thought I would do a video on it. So the question is, how do you colour Jesmonite, and like what brands, what pigments can you use? So I thought I'd do a little test run showing you different ways that you can colour it. I'm also going to be using the Australian version that you can get. So I'm going to be using the OG Jesmonite, the AC, I think it's like the AC 100, but I'm also going to be using the Barnes version of their version of Jesmonite, I guess, yeah. And I'm going to be doing two lots of tests because obviously Jesmonite in Australia, I don't know about the rest of the world, but since it's become incredibly popular, it's become incredibly hard to get your hands on. So I'm also going to be doing the exact same test on the Barnes version, which is an Australian brand, and just showing you the differences between the two. First up, we're going to be testing out the Jesmonite AC 100. The first pigment that I'm going to be trying to mix in to the Jesmonite is this scarlet red pigment, and this one is from Barnes. It's actually a tint that's designed to work in polyurethane and epoxy resin. So I was really interested to see if this would set and how vibrant the colors would be working with an acrylic resin like Jesmonite. So I've pre-mixed up all of my Jesmonite, and I've just got little individual amounts to do each coaster, and I ended up doing about 10 drops of this Barnes Scarlet Red, and then I'm just going to pour that into my mold once I've given it a really good mix through. Next up, I'm going to be testing out some acrylic paint. So this is just a cheap acrylic paint, but in my head this should work because it's an acrylic paint and this is an acrylic resin, so we're using the same sort of base. So we shouldn't have too much of a weird chemical reaction using this one, but it will just be interesting to see how vibrant it comes out or whether it goes really pastel in our Jesmonite. So I'm just giving this a really good mix up, and then I'm going to be pouring it into my coaster mold just like I did on my first test piece. The third colour product we're going to be trying out in our Jesmonite is an epoxy resin pigment paste. So this is a really strong cherry red, but it's not showing up that great on camera. I just thought I'd give this one a test out just because I know that there'll be a lot of questions whether you can use pigments that you use in epoxy resin in Jesmonite, because they are both resins, and you'll probably get a lot of crossover with resin artists and Jesmonite artists wanting to use both products. So this is an epoxy paste, and so it does contain a little bit of epoxy, and I thought it'd be really interesting to see how that works well together. And then the last one that we're going to be testing, which we already know works really well in Jesmonite, is the Jesmonite pigment. So a little bit of this pigment goes a really long way, and it gives you a really vibrant red, and you can see we get a really nice smooth consistency throughout the whole piece of the Jesmonite. You might have noticed when I added the epoxy pigment paste into the Jesmonite, it started to get a bit thick and a bit hard to work with. So I thought I'd retest that one out again, just making sure it wasn't because I had left the Jesmonite for too long. So this is a minute after I had just mixed up Jesmonite and added epoxy paste into it, and you can see it instantly goes really thick. We've just done our test pieces for the Jesmonite, so now it's time to move on to the Barnes alternative to Jesmonite, which is the Fortin MG. So this one is a really great option if you are in Australia. I find that it is incredibly similar to the Jesmonite AC 100, but I just wanted to see how the pigments would work differently between the two, and I thought it'd be a really interesting test to do. So first up, I am using the Jesmonite pigment in my Barnes alternative, and I get a really nice smooth, even coverage the whole way through, and it still looks to be quite vibrant in our Barnes version. So I'm pretty happy with this so far. Now we're testing out the resin pigment in the Barnes version. So we're just going to see if this has the same effect it did in the Jesmonite, where it made the Jesmonite set super fast and go really thick. I also didn't get a great color coming through using it in the Jesmonite. It was really pale, and I feel like I'm getting the exact same effect with this one. You don't really see that it's a cherry red at all. At best, it's a really soft mauve. So I think we've ruled ruled out that using epoxy pigment pastes do not work in either version. And on our third coaster in our Barnes 410 mg, we're going to be adding in our acrylic paint. And the last colour that we're going to be testing today is the Barnes tint. I've done about 10 drops, which is the same amount that I used last time. I'm giving that a really good mix through my 410. Now, in theory, I'm using 2 Barnes products, a Barnes colour and a Barnes acrylic resin, but the tints do say that they are designed for polyester and epoxy resin. It doesn't say it's designed for this particular product, even though it is the same brand, but it'd be really interesting to see when it does set, whether it does set and what kind of colour it does set to, and whether you can use these products.
I would say the biggest surprise for me today with doing this test, because we've tested, the 4 different pigment reds that I had on hand, was the Barnes Scarlet Red pigment. So this is a tint pigment that I like to use a lot when I'm working with like my, when I'm making like resin jewelry, or when I am doing like any sort of resin artwork, but it's always like a tint. But the biggest surprise to me was how different it is between the Jesmonite, which is this version, and they had the same amount of drops, like 10 to 11 drops, and the same amount of product, to it being in the Barnes version. Like, that's the color difference. So in the Jesmonite, it doesn't, it's set the same, it's got the same sort of smooth surface. I can't tell any difference between the actual finish, but it's just so much more pale in the Jesmonite than it is in the Barnes. Maybe because this is a Barnes color, so they've designed it to work generally well with all of their products, because it does say for polyurethane and epoxy resin, so it's not necessarily designed to work with their alternative, which is, I think it's like the MG Fortin. But it does work really well, because that's kind of the similar color that you'd get if you were to put it into epoxy or polyurethane. So that's just kind of surprised me a bit, the massive difference between the two. I didn't know whether there would be a big difference with pigments in them. I thought they might all kind of come out the same. And the only other really big difference, the Jesmonite red in the Fortin and in the Jesmonite, pretty much spot on coloring. The same with the acrylic paint, pretty spot on color wise. And obviously the epoxy resin pigment, not great, but still pretty much the same color wise. The only one that had a big difference in color was using the tints. So if you are going to use the Barnes version and you've got these tints, they work really well, but not so great in the Jesmonite. And if you're going to be using the Jesmonite coloring, it works great in both versions, as well as acrylic paint in both versions. The only thing that didn't work great was the epoxy resin paste, and I really think that is because epoxy resin paste already contain a little bit of resin. That's how they are in that paste-like substance. And so then when they were getting mixed into an acrylic-based resin, they just did not do well. It was a little bit better in the Jesmonite, but it did not do well at all in the Barnes acrylic resin. It's got a really matte texture to it, but this still had a bit of a smooth texture, and it does not look like that bright cherry red. This doesn't show up that great on camera, but it is a really beautiful cherry red. The color does not transfer over, and it just separated. You can just see it when you look close up that it did not blend through easily, and it also made both Jesmonite and the Fortin set super fast, within minutes. So I would not recommend putting either of into either one. Sorry, I've lost my words for a second. I would not recommend using epoxy paste. So far, everything else I've used works really great in both kinds. But yeah, epoxy paste because it obviously contains a little bit of epoxy, did not work well. I hope this tutorial was super helpful. If you found that you got some great information out of it, feel free to give it a big thumbs up. It really helps the video out and lets YouTube know to show this to more people that would be interested in this subject. If you are new to my channel, please do subscribe. I post new videos every single week, all to do with candle making, Jesmonite, resin art, and alcohol inks. So those are the 4 topics that I mostly cover. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below, and thank you guys so much for watching.